Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Research America Alliance discussion. Thank you as always for joining us and for your partnership in our alliance. Today I'm really excited to be joined by Dr. James Crowe. He is the recipient of Research America's 223 Building the Foundation Award. And did I say 223 instead of 2023? That's a bad sign. Anyway, that's only one of the many, many amazing things about Dr. Crowe. And I would love to set the stage now. It's a very brief video, but it talks about the award and Dr. Crowe's extraordinary work. So let me turn it over.
Thank you for joining us in recognizing Research America's 2023 Advocacy Awards honorees. Our awards honor those who have made extraordinary contributions in the progress of medical and health research. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. James E. Crowe, who will receive the Building the Foundation Award. This award recognizes individuals whose basic research discoveries have played a pivotal role in advancing public health. Dr. Crowe and his lab developed technologies to rapidly develop and advance clinical trial antibodies against COVID-19. We look forward to hearing more about your work.
I'm a pediatrician and an infectious disease physician by background. I've always personally had a deep concern for the most vulnerable people who are often at high risk for severe disease during infectious disease events, especially epidemics.
Dr. Crowe's admirable passion is developing antibody therapeutics to protect the most vulnerable among us from infectious diseases.
So our team has been dedicated for many years at finding what are called medical countermeasures, things like antibodies or drugs or vaccines to counteract the bad effects of infectious disease outbreaks.
Weeks after the first case of COVID-19 was reported in the United States, he and his team applied their rapid antibody discovery platform to identify hundreds of monoclonal antibodies against SARS-CoV-2.
We built a team that is able to respond very quickly. It's been very gratifying that we were able to contribute to solutions that help people during COVID. That's very special to be in a place where you have the knowledge and the tools and experience to apply yourself fully.
Through rational selection, they chose two antibodies to combine into a cocktail that was licensed and proved effective in large clinical trials.
One of our team members expressed it very well. After several months of working on COVID, we turned the antibodies over to a commercial partner that turned it into a drug. He said, "Oh, that was the hardest thing I've ever done. And wow, I'd like to go back and do it again."
The rapid development of this antibody therapeutic by Dr. Crowe is a medical research success story eminently deserving of this award.
The career of having a curious exploration of how things work has never been better. And so I just advocate for the pleasure of it, but also the chance to make solutions for the entire world.
One could say it takes the passion and commitment to always ask, what if this would work? And not why wouldn't it? We have seen that kind of passion and commitment in the honorees of this award. Thank you for the extraordinary work you've done and will continue to do for human health.
Wow, that's a hard act to follow. I'd really love to start with what Dr. Haidt said, and that is that innovation comes from what if this would work instead of what if it wouldn't, or it probably wouldn't. Did you ever have those moments in your work on antibodies where you thought, I am barking up a tree that is, and I'm never going to kind of come to some solution here, or were you always kind of optimistic?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think I was reading recently historical stories from Václav Havel and Nelson Mandela and other people who had lived through very challenging circumstances.
Yeah.
And they were pointing out the difference between hope and optimism. So hope you get the job done and you know what you need to do and you have it set as a goal. Optimism is you think it's likely that that's going to happen. And they were pointing out there were many times in their political and activist careers where there was no optimism warranted, but they still kept the hope and ultimately got the job done. And I think there were moments for our team during COVID where that happened. We studied some of the immune response of about the first dozen or so people in the United States who were infected, and we really just could not find what we needed in these people because their response was so early. And we had some despair or lack of optimism, but it was such an important effort. We knew we had to persist. And so I think the hope persisted through the discouragement that was temporary. And that hope fueled us to step forward every day. And it worked out okay in the end. So I think the operative word is hope, actually.
I really love it. And I think it really relates to advocacy too, because you keep your eye on the goal. You don't always feel like the odds are with you or against you, but it's you need to keep knowing that things are going to change. And if you keep working at it and keep working at it, I just really love that. The other thing that came up in the video was your interest in ensuring vulnerable populations in particular, have hope and that there's solutions for them. How does that relate to the development of finding antibodies for pandemics like COVID?
Well, yes, vaccines are probably the most important technology of the 20th century. We have to look at the fact that lifespan basically doubled over the 20th century, and that was due to better hygiene, clean water and sanitation. But about half of it was prevention of deaths from infectious diseases. So vaccines are amazing. But when you get a vaccine, you're injected or exposed to something and your body does the job. Your body mounts an immune response and that's what protects you. But not everyone's immune response is equally capable of doing that. So if you take a newborn baby, they're very vulnerable. They're not easy to vaccinate. If you take a 90-year-old person, their immune system is waning. They're not able to respond as effectively. And then we have about 15 million people in the United States who are immunocompromised or high risk because of cancer treatments, transplants. There's just so many people who are not good candidates for vaccines. And so we wanted to fill in the gap, and we can do that with the molecules from your body that are called antibodies. And we can we could take them from one person and give them to another. And we achieve what I like to call instant immunity. We achieve the immunity of the recipients. Yeah.
I mean, I'm kind of embarrassed to say I did not look at it from that frame where there's kind of a continuum of need. And a piece of that is where vaccines need a supplement. And that's really a very interesting way of looking at it. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about something else that you said during the video, and I thought that was really cool. You said that one of your colleagues on the team, if I'm remembering this right, there were two things kind of going on. They were kind of handing off the baby, Yeah. They're like, yeah. or actually it's more like, I guess, a relay race, right? We've got you here and we worked as fast as we possibly could. And there have been years of research behind us. Now it's your turn. And
yes.
I think what he meant when he said, that was the hardest thing I've ever done, I want to do it again, was his piece of the race. Is that right? And then handing it off was like, woof. And then who's next in that line typically? Is it industry, or is it is it clinical research of the academic setting, or?
Well, interesting. These types of efforts require extraordinary collaborations and cooperation between groups who have different types of expertise. So my own group specializes in finding and working with humans who have survived infections, taking a blood sample and looking through the immune cells in that blood sample to do what we call discovery, to discover an antibody that is a candidate to be used as a drug. It's a natural molecule, but once we have it in our hand, we have to show that it has promise for working. So we work with animal experts who work with small animals like mice or non-human primates in very specialized facilities. These are very sensitive fields of study that need to be done very carefully, and they require veterinarians and all sorts of other people. And then once we have the antibody validated as promising, we will pass the baton on, usually to industry, and they have to convert that from a candidate molecule, something that looks promising, into a real drug. They need to make it. And some of the challenges, making enough of it, not just making a little bit like we do in our research lab,
Right.
but making enough to give all over the country or all over the world. So that, what that person was talking about was following discovery and all the animal experiments. We knew what the winner was, but we didn't know if it could be made in a factory safely and distributed.
So safely, consistently, right? And then you get into the temperature and all these.
All that.
Wow.
And then there's a whole world downstream of that, of clinical research, where the manufacturers then pass the baton to doctors and nurses and researchers who work with volunteers, participants in studies. And there we give the antibody by, with a needle in your arm, basically, and look to see, is it safe? Is it well tolerated? And do the levels of that antibody go up in the body so that they would protect? And ultimately, those studies showed that the antibody did protect. So that whole field of clinical research is an enormous enterprise that needs to be done very carefully and ethically. And there's just so many people involved in these efforts.
And let me ask you about funding streams. And the piece I'm wondering about, so the basic research often, but not always, but most often is covered by federal grants, right? I mean, there are certainly pharmas that have a basic research shop. How about the piece you were talking about, where it's usually very carefully, executed, and really kind of veterinarians come into play, the animal research part? Is that typically federally funded, or is it sometimes both, or?
Well, most groups who do things at scale have to put together all sorts of types of funding. So the earliest parts actually, in our case, is sometimes funded by philanthropy or endowed chairs or institutions, because you have to generate enough preliminary data to show that the general idea is worthy of federal dollars. So federal grants typically require some prior work. So often institutions and philanthropists fund the earliest parts. And then with a competitive peer review process, NIH in particular typically sponsors most of the early research around discovery and infectious diseases. Also the Department of Defense. So we've gotten support from DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Development Agency.
I didn't realize that they actually fund projects like this. That's
yeah, they were a very important part of the COVID effort, and other parts of DoD, the military, and so you either have military funding, NIH funding for these discovery processes. Then to pass the baton, the United States government actually does have development monies that are supported through an agency called BARDA. So ASPR and BARDA are agencies that try to take things the next stage, make them into products, and they will fund things that are not commercially viable. So things like drugs for Ebola or Zika and things like that, they're not really a market unless there's an epidemic. So the United States government often funds some of the downstream stuff. if the target is important commercially, like let's say you had a flu vaccine, a flu antibody, a flu drug, doctors want to use that. People want to get that. People will pay money. Insurance will reimburse for that. So in that case, we might pass the baton on to a pharma or a biotech, and they put their own private monies into it. So it's a little bit like a spider web. For each project, you have to figure out who's the target population and is there money downstream or not. And then we kind of cobble together pathways. But the federal government in the United States is I would say the major funder of this type of research.
You know, I think that's, and by the way, you're going to have to really stop being a researcher and come be an advocate, because you're great. Because it's half of the battle is really explaining this, and you've helped me look at it. And that spider also gets to advocacy. I'm sure you know this. Like, if you only advocate for one piece of this web, then when does a patient benefit? You know, and how do they benefit? So we talked a little bit, and I had the opportunity to talk to you before the holidays about the energy, the urgency driving energy and collaborative spirit, and that kind of get her done with COVID countermeasures, and how, number one, how to not let that dissipate while it's still needed. And number two, how to capture that spirit and apply it to other major health threats, and what health threat really isn't major when a life is risk or ability is at risk. So talk to me about that. Have you done any more thinking since we had a chance to noodle over that?
Yes, so I think it's been widely discussed that the typical kinetics of the public concern around these events is a panic neglect cycle. So something happens, everyone's scared and said, didn't the United States government prepare for this? Where's our vaccines, drugs, antibodies? We need them right now. And then people like us launch into very robust research to try to rapidly get things done. And then about a year later, people don't care anymore. They want to sort of forget about it and move on. And they don't want to think about that particular outbreak. And they certainly don't want to think about another outbreak. And we enter into this neglect cycle where we don't want to support it. We don't want funding. You know, it just, you sort of ignore the problem. And historically, what's happening though is these episodes are accelerating. So we've had bird flu and Zika and Ebola, COVID, and so on. There's been chikungunya, maybe you've forgotten that one, the joint virus. So we've having these outbreaks every 12 to 18 months. So we know they're going to happen because of the connectedness of the world. So I think we're just in denial if we say, oh, we don't want to think about that anymore.
Yeah.
And my preference would be, instead of getting faster and faster response systems where we're always scrambling, why don't we think ahead of time and just prepare ahead of time?
Yeah.
And when something happens, then we say, yeah, we already have the solution for that. We're good, and snuff it out when it's small. So we've started a program called Ahead 100, and that is to try to make antibody solutions like what we do instead of just for COVID or just for Ebola. We're trying to do it for the 100 most likely causes of future epidemics and shift from panic to preparedness. That's really what we're trying to do.
I just love that. And, you know, we've gotten there, I guess, with the exception of terrorism, where we did have a big reset, right, after 9/11. But defense, the national defense, is prevention oriented, combat ready oriented. So in some sense, that same mindset, because we all have folks too, other things are coming more fast and furious, like Alzheimer's prevalence, you know, or at least the case number. So, and you know, it's just interesting to think about that mindset and how to accommodate reality, which is we do move from one big thing to another big thing typically, and we forget the last thing, even though we need to prepare for the next thing, you know. So to keep in mind that that's a reality of the way the human mind might work, and how to how to work with that. But
Yeah.
what you're doing, are you coordinating with your work and the 100 days part of the, I call it the fifth, and that's wrong, the financial, the global effort to prepare?
Yes. Yeah.
Are you all working under that umbrella or with them collaboratively?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the spectrum of things that you need to respond to an epidemic, you need surveillance systems that are in place all the time, and people are working on getting that deployed. You need tests. If you have a nasal swab and you want to know, does it have a virus? You need the virus test. So
Yes.
that's diagnostics. There's a whole field of diagnostics that needs to be better developed, cheaper, better, faster. And then if you diagnose something, then what can you do about it? And there you need vaccines and antibodies and small molecule drugs or antiviral drugs or antibiotics. So each of those fields, often they're working a little bit in silos. And yet COVID showed us they need to be fully integrated so that the diagnostic tests are linked in the surveillance systems to delivering the therapy. And I do think we made progress during COVID. You saw a lot of the government agencies. There's been a lot of criticism of the agencies, but a lot of them work very well together. And there was an effort called Operation Warp Speed, where the public health officials and the military worked together hand in hand cooperatively in one effort called Operation Warp Speed.
Another Research America award recipient.
Okay, well, the cooperativity there, and I think that is an example that you're talking about. We don't want to lose that spirit to where we all go back into our silos. So we learned a lot in COVID. We didn't do it perfectly, but this cooperativity and collaboration across government agencies, public, private, even across countries, we saw a lot of cooperativity. So I do think we want to build on that.
I love that. And I know it's time to bring on Sam for audience questions. I have so many more questions. So this hurts me, but time to pass the baton. Sam.
Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Crowe, and the conversation has been great so far. So we have a question in the chat here. Were there IP challenges associated with your discoveries? How do you foresee ARPA-H funds positioned vis-a-vis DARPA funds in your research area moving forward?
Great question.
Okay, so those are two questions. One is intellectual property. And I think, I think you have to sort of check your attitude. How do you feel about money and capitalism to get into that question? So you can take the view, I don't like companies because they make money and that's bad, sort of. That's kind of a generic view. And this is health, and health is a right. Why don't we just give away everything free? And believe me, I like that idea that we would all have full access to every health thing ever free. But when you look at systems that run that way, you don't end up with drug development. You don't end up with vaccines. You don't get anything. I mean, you're just sort of dead in the water. So our system is a capitalist system, and it's run on capital, which is money. And in order for manufacturers to bring in their own resources, and when you say company, where do they get the resources? They get that from investors. And I would wager that most people on this call probably have funds and mutual funds in their retirement or other investments. So when we say those people with money, we're talking about us, the people who are investing in these companies, and the companies have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. So I think we need to be cautious when our mind drifts and we want to demonize companies because they think about capital. I don't think they fundamentally only think about capital. They want to do amazing innovation for public health, and capital is the tool that runs that. And they get that from the American people as investors. Let's just think about it that way. So they're actually generally forces for good, and that's the way I look at it. And they're partners. And so in order to invest, and then their fiduciary responsibilities to get return on investment back, they actually have to make some kind of margin or at least break even. Because if they take your money and they give you back less money, then that breaks their fiduciary responsibility. And actually, you're not happy about that. So intellectual property is a tool to allow individuals or companies to have a period of time when they make a margin on their investment, which they give back to their investors. That's return on investment. So intellectual property actually in our system is critical. I really believe it has to be secured. And so the conception of a new idea is an invention, and that's registered with the patent offices in the US and all over the world. And then that traffics along with the material, with the invention, and allows the company to invest and bring it to market and get it. So we spent a lot of time during COVID and all the other efforts filing invention disclosures, working with lawyers to write the patents, to secure them so that we can give them to the company so that they're protected for a period of time. And so that's a little bit of a long answer, but I think intellectual property in the United States has facilitated the world's, currently the world's most robust biotech and pharma scenario and in history. So intellectual property underlies all of public health, believe me. So that's important. Now, I do think that pharma does have a world responsibility in places places just can't pay. They literally can't pay. They ought to make a route forward, and they do, to give away the product to CEPI and WHO. And you see Moderna not protecting their patents so that other people can practice those patents in other countries and so on. So I do think there is a moral responsibility to make things available to people who can't pay, totally. But you don't even get those things without intellectual property to give away. The second question, remind me, was?
How do you foresee ARPA-H funds positioned?
ARPA-H, yeah. So ARPA-H is a new effort that's really more sort of NIH direction and flavored. And then you see DARPA is, a particular agency, mostly DOD, has some responsibility to report to the White House. And they're very much about innovation, disruptive technology. So they'll say, we funded, the invention of the internet and stealth technology and GPS and things like that are transformative for all society and all countries, not just a little military application. And so I think DARPA, when they came into this space, they said, we want to see an outbreak occur and have the solution 60 days later. That was crazy when they funded us to, think that on, we and some other people. Ultimately, for COVID, we discovered those antibodies 25 days.
Wow.
From the time we got the blood sample, we gave AstraZeneca, the partner, the sequences for that in 25 days. So DARPA had this crazy can't do it vision. They put money behind it and we figured out how to do it. It's sort of an engineering sort of problem. Whereas ARPA-H, my understanding is they're going to take a systematic broad view to identify the most likely pathogens that are going to cause disease, identify prototype pathogens, like what are examples that we should work on, not knowing which is going to be, work through all that systematically so we understand basically all the threats against us, and meanwhile, bring technologies to bear to make solutions. So it's a little bit different tack. In my understanding, it's a little more systematic, whereas DARPA is sort of a crazy disruptive technology play. And I think they work together. They're complementary, but they're not really the same or overlapping. I don't see them as redundant at all.
I don't think they're redundant. I will add that from Research America's perspective, we're hoping for kind of an and. So we would like ARPA-H to, along with NIH, to have this role in looking at these viral families, doing exactly what you mentioned there, but also be a disruptor. That part of its DNA is in the health space to work side by side with DARPA in do it fast, do it new, big spend, high risk, and change our world. So I think both are true.
Yeah, I understated. Well, so the difference between ARPA-H and conventional NIH funding that's been going on, which itself is, there's a lot of innovation that goes on in NIH. Oh, yeah. They have a lot of new innovator programs. Believe me, most of my life I've been an NIH loyalist, and I came from the NIH intramural program myself. I spent 5 years.
Oh, that's cool.
NIH is really a lot of the magic here. But yes, I think my understanding is ARPA-H is sort of separated out into this particular space to allow them to be a little more free form than some of the historical structures of NIH. But I mean, again, they're going to be collaborative because NIH is still going to be funding important research in this space, and a lot of it's going to be innovative. So it's just sort of and. I like that word, and, not or. Yeah.
Great.
So we are coming up on time.
No.
We could do this for another 2 hours, I think. But I think we'll leave you with one final question, if that works for you, Dr. Crowe.
Okay.
Do you have any advice on how to convey the multi-sector nature of R&D to policymakers and their respective staff members? So much of the work that you do is so critical to the work that happens on the Hill. How do we convey that?
Yeah, I like what was already said earlier in the call. We understand military models. I mean, wars have been going on for millennia, and they've been studied in their strategy. And we are essentially the only superpower in the world left. We have incredible understanding of how to do a strong military that prevents war. We don't want to go to war. We don't want war. But we have built military systems that prevent war because of the strength and the preparedness of the United States. So I think that model, if you look at what do they do in the military to get ready, there's so many diverse people in so many disciplines. And sometimes I think about if you have, in that model, you have a warfighter that's out at the very front of the action, in the conflict. Sometimes you'll hear the phrase tip of the spear. That you could say, well, that's the most important person. There might be 5,000 people in a line behind that person, bringing the coordination, the communications, the supplies. And, more important than shooting is not shooting, because you're trying to withhold fire and do the least, you're just trying to present, preparedness. And so I think supply chain and all that kind of stuff in the military, we totally understand that. And I think Congress understands that. And so if we said, well, we're fighting a foe that's, tiny but deadly like COVID, but we need that entire type of multidisciplinary, sustained effort. And the training, we do training in the military. We need to keep training, the next generations in medicine and innovation. I think that's a really good model. And others have said this. Bill Gates have said, we understand how to go into an outbreak of violence. Why can we not build a strike force that goes in with support of, a whole organization behind it? And
I really love it. I love it on behalf of all of the people we lost, and are still losing to pandemics and to Alzheimer's, to cancer, to rare disease.
Yeah.
Oh, I would really love to keep talking, but I know that we definitely have a deadline for you, because you have a couple other things to do. Advocacy is one, and other things. And but thank you so very much. I'm going to call you James, and I hope we'll be seeing you at our awards.
Yes, thank you so much.
And but we'll be talking to you more and learning from you more. But thank you very much for today.
Awesome.
And I know, Sam, you have, I know it's supposed to be me, but I hope it's you, a couple of announcements, homework, not homework, whatever, housekeeping.
Housekeeping, yes. So we do hope that you will all join us, for those in our audience, next Tuesday, January 17th at 1:30 p.m. for our next Alliance discussion with our another Advocacy Award winner, Dr. Pamela Davis, who is the Dean of the School.
She's amazing,
Yes.
amazing.
It promises to be an amazing conversation. And she is the winner of Research America's 2023 Herbert Pardes Family Award for National Leadership in Advocacy for Research. So I will put a link to register for that in the chat now. And thank you again, Dr. Crowe, for your time today and all of your amazing work. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Bye, everyone.
Much.